The mahogany table cracked like thunder as Officer Bradley Hutchins slammed his meaty fist against its polished surface, sending papers cascading to the floor like autumn leaves caught in a violent storm. The sound reverberated through the cramped HOA meeting room, bouncing off beige walls adorned with framed certificates and community achievement plaques that now seemed to mock the chaos unfolding beneath them. "You think you can waltz in here with that stolen valor costume and intimidate us?" Hutchins's voice cut through the stunned silence. His face flushed crimson with rage. Spittle flew from his lips as he jabbed a thick finger toward the man seated calmly across from him. "I've had enough of your kind thinking you can pull one over on decent, hard-working Americans." Marcus Washington remained perfectly still in his chair. His navy dress, blue uniform, immaculate despite the hostile atmosphere. Every crease was razor-sharp, every ribbon precisely aligned. The silver dolphins on his chest, catching the harsh fluorescent light. His dark hands rested calmly on the table, wedding ring glinting as his fingers remained motionless. Only his eyes moved, tracking Hutchins with the measured awareness of someone who had faced far deadlier threats in darker places. The room held its collective breath. 23 residents of Willowbrook Heights had gathered for what should have been a routine HOA dispute hearing, but the air now crackled with the kind of tension that precedes an explosion. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the HOA board president, sat frozen at the head of the table, her usual authoritative demeanor replaced by wide-eyed uncertainty as she watched her hired security officer spiral out of control. This morning had begun like any other Tuesday in the affluent suburb. Marcus had pressed his uniform with military precision, just as he had every morning for the past 15 years of his naval career. The routine brought him comfort, an anchor of discipline in civilian life that sometimes felt as foreign as the distant battlefields he had left behind. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Silver Star for valor under fire, and led countless rescue operations that saved American lives. Now, at 42, he was fighting a different kind of battle, one that threatened not his life, but his home. The dispute had started 6 months earlier, when Marcus and his wife Sarah had moved into their dream house on Maple Street. The colonial-style home with its wraparound porch and mature oak trees represented everything they had worked toward during his military service. Sarah, a pediatric nurse, had fallen in love with the neighborhood's reputation for excellent schools and strong community values. They had saved every penny for 15 years, living in cramped base housing and making sacrifices that their civilian neighbors could never imagine. But paradise had proven more fragile than either of them anticipated. The trouble began with small things, petty complaints that seemed designed to provoke rather than resolve. Their mailbox was allegedly 3 inches too far from the curb. Their garden stones were apparently the wrong shade of gray. Their American flag, which Marcus flew with the pride of someone who had bled for it, was supposedly hung at an incorrect angle. Each citation had been delivered with increasing hostility by Officer Hutchins, a man whose 20-year career in small-town law enforcement had been marked more by complaints of excessive force than commendations for service. When the city had outsourced HOA enforcement to private security companies, Hutchins had found his calling in petty tyranny, wielding clipboard authority with the enthusiasm of someone finally given permission to indulge his worst impulses. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago when Hutchins had issued a violation notice for Marcus's vegetable garden, claiming it violated community aesthetic standards. The garden was Sarah's pride and joy, a carefully tended plot where she grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that reminded her of her grandmother's farm in Alabama. When Marcus had politely requested the specific ordinance being violated, Hutchins had become belligerent, suggesting that people like you didn't belong in neighborhoods like Willowbrook Heights. The comment had hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had stood in that spot, wearing civilian clothes, feeling the familiar weight of being judged not by his character or achievements, but by the color of his skin. It was a wound that military service had never fully healed. A reminder that some battles followed you home, regardless of how many others you had won in foreign lands. Now, sitting in this suffocating meeting room, Marcus felt the familiar calm that had served him in life or death situations. His breathing remained steady, his heartbeat controlled. He had learned long ago that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most dangerous one. And that true strength often revealed itself in moments of restraint rather than reaction. Mr. Washington has every right to contest these citations, Mrs. Pemberton finally managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. This is a formal hearing. Officer Hutchins, and I expect you to conduct yourself professionally. Hutchins wheeled around to face her, his bulk making the movement seem almost comical, if not for the genuine menace radiating from his posture. Professional, he laughed, a harsh sound that contained no humor. You want to talk about professional? This fraud sitting here in a uniform he probably bought online is making a mockery of every real serviceman who ever lived. I did 2 years in the Army Reserve. Lady, I know stolen valor when I see it. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Several residents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, uncertain whether to intervene or simply bear witness to the unfolding catastrophe. Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Not anger, but something deeper and more dangerous. The protective instinct that had kept his squad alive when bullets were flying, and everything depended on split-second decisions. Officer Hutchins, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed under pressure. I think you should sit down. The suggestion only inflamed Hutchins further. His face darkened to an unhealthy shade of purple as he took a step closer to where Marcus sat. Don't you dare try to order me around, boy. I've had enough of your disrespectful attitude. Stand up when I'm talking to you. The racial undertone in boy was unmistakable, delivered with the particular venom of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to use it. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the other residents processed what they had just heard. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, audibly gasped. Young Jennifer Mills, a recent college graduate who worked as a social worker, began reaching for her phone with shaking hands. Marcus remained seated, his posture unchanged. In his peripheral vision, he could see his wife Sarah in the back row of folding chairs, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. They had discussed this moment, knowing it would eventually come. She had begged him to let their lawyer handle everything, to avoid any situation where his mere presence might be seen as threatening. But Marcus had insisted on appearing personally, believing that hiding behind representatives would only validate their neighbors' prejudices. I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down and lower your voice, Marcus said, each word carefully measured. We're here to discuss property violations, not to engage in personal attacks. Hutchins's response was swift and vicious. Personal attacks. You want to see a personal attack? He lunged forward, his hands reaching for Marcus's shoulders as if to physically force him to stand. Get up, you lying piece of... The world seemed to slow down as Hutchins's hands made contact with Marcus's uniform. In that instant, muscle memory took over, reflexes honed by years of combat training and life-threatening situations. Marcus could have ended the confrontation in a dozen different ways. Could have put Hutchins on the floor before the man knew what was happening. Instead, he made a choice that would define everything that followed. He remained perfectly still. The contrast was stark and damning. Hutchins, red-faced and breathing heavily, gripping the shoulders of a man who sat with the composure of a statue. Marcus's eyes never left Hutchins's face, never showed fear or anger, only a kind of patient endurance that seemed to highlight the other man's loss of control. "Take your hands off me," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying no threat, only a simple statement of fact. But Hutchins was beyond hearing reason. Years of accumulated resentment, professional frustration, and unchecked prejudice had found their target. He began shaking Marcus by the shoulders, his voice rising to a near shout. "You think that uniform makes you special? You think it gives you the right to come into our neighborhood and start trouble? I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for disturbing the peace and fraud." The absurdity of the charges might have been laughable under different circumstances. But there was nothing funny about the hatred contorting Hutchins' features, or the way his grip tightened on Marcus's uniform. Several residents were now on their feet, some recording with their phones, others backing toward the door as if sensing that violence was inevitable. Mrs. Pemberton stood up so quickly that her chair toppled backward. "Officer Hutchins, you need to stop this immediately. Mr. Washington, I'm so sorry. This is completely unacceptable." "Shut up," Hutchins roared at her, spittle flying across the table. "This is police business now. I'm calling for backup to deal with this situation properly." He fumbled for the radio clipped to his belt, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. "Dispatch, this is Hutchins requesting immediate assistance at the Willowbrook HOA building. I have a subject resisting arrest and impersonating military personnel." The radio crackled to life, a bored-sounding dispatcher asking for details. But before Hutchins could respond, a voice from the back of the room cut through the chaos like a bell tolling in the distance. "Wait a minute." The voice belonged to Bob Richardson, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s who had been sitting quietly in the corner. "I know that man." Everyone turned toward Richardson, whose weathered face had gone pale. He was staring at Marcus with the expression of someone who had just seen a ghost, his rheumy eyes wide with recognition. "Sweet Jesus in heaven, I know who that is." Hutchins released Marcus's shoulders, momentarily thrown off his game by the interruption. "What are you talking about, old man?" Richardson ignored him, his attention focused entirely on Marcus. "You're Commander Washington. Marcus Washington. I saw you on the news 2 years ago when they did that feature on Medal of Honor candidates." His voice grew stronger with each word, decades of military bearing reasserting itself. "The Silver Star recipient. The man who saved those Marines in Kandahar." The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning became deafening. Hutchins looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route that had suddenly vanished. Several residents pulled out their phones, fingers flying over screens as they searched for confirmation of Richardson's claim. "That's impossible," Hutchins stammered, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "He's just some guy trying to scam his way out of HOA violations. People buy military uniforms online all the time." Jennifer Mills looked up from her phone, her face flushed with embarrassment and outrage. "Oh my God! Mr. Richardson is right. There's an entire Wikipedia page about Commander Washington. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He received the Silver Star for leading a rescue mission that saved 12 Marines who were trapped by enemy fire. She paused, reading further. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but it was downgraded due to political reasons." Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had gasped earlier, was now openly weeping. "I remember that story," she whispered. "My grandson was one of the Marines he saved. Tommy Patterson. He's alive today because—" She looked at Marcus with something approaching reverence. "Because of you." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. One by one, residents began to understand the magnitude of what they had witnessed. They had watched a decorated war hero, a man who had risked his life for his country, being assaulted and humiliated by a petty tyrant drunk on imagined authority. Hutchins began backing toward the door, his face cycling through shades of red and white as the full implications of his actions became clear. "This doesn't change anything," he said, but his voice cracked like a teenager's. "He still violated HOA regulations. He still needs to follow the rules like everyone else." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus slowly rose from his chair. The movement was fluid and controlled, each motion deliberate and measured. At his full height of 6'2", wearing his dress blues with 15 years of military bearing, he commanded the room in a way that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with earned respect. "Officer Hutchins," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had led men in combat. "You need to understand something. I didn't serve my country for 15 years so that I could come home and be treated like a second-class citizen in my own neighborhood. I didn't earn a Silver Star so that some failed police officer could question my right to exist in a house I bought with my own money." He took a step forward, and Hutchins instinctively stepped back. But there was nothing threatening in Marcus's posture, only an implacable dignity that made the other man's earlier aggression seem even more shameful in contrast. "I've been patient with your harassment because I believe in following proper procedures. I've endured your insults because I took an oath to protect the rights of all Americans, even ones who don't extend the same courtesy to me. But what you did here today, putting your hands on me in anger, calling me boy, questioning my service to this country that crosses a line that no amount of patience can excuse." Hutchins's radio crackled again, the dispatcher asking for a status update. With shaking hands, he raised it to his lips. "Dispatch, disregard the previous call. Situation resolved." "Are you sure about that?" Marcus asked, his tone conversational, but somehow loaded with implications. "Because it seems to me that a law enforcement officer, even a contracted one, who physically assaults a citizen during a civil proceeding, might have some explaining to do to his supervisors." The truth of this statement hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Every person in the room had witnessed Hutchins initiate physical contact, had heard him make racially charged statements, had seen him lose control in a situation where professionalism was not just expected, but legally required. "Mrs. Pemberton found her voice, though it trembled with barely controlled emotion. "Officer Hutchins, you're relieved of duty immediately. Please leave the premises before I call the real police to have you removed." "You can't fire me," Hutchins protested, but the fight had gone out of him. He looked around the room, seeing only faces filled with disgust and disappointment. "I was just doing my job. I was trying to maintain order." "Your job," Richardson said, his Vietnam-era Marine training evident in his ramrod posture, "is to serve and protect, not to assault heroes who've done more for this country than you ever will." Jennifer Mills looked up from her phone again, her expression grim. "I've already posted the video I took to social media. It's already getting shared. A lot." She showed her screen to the room. Hashtag HOA attacks. Hero is trending. The color drained from Hutchins's face as he realized that his moment of rage had been captured and was now spreading across the internet at viral speed. In the age of social media, there was no controlling the narrative once it escaped into the digital wilderness. Marcus raised a hand, silencing the room. "Mrs. Mills, I appreciate your support, but I don't need internet fame to validate my service. What I need is for this community to understand that respect isn't something that should have to be earned through military service. It should be given to every resident, regardless of their background." He turned to address the room as a whole, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had addressed troops before dangerous missions. "I moved to Willowbrook Heights, Because my wife and I believed it represented the American dream we both served to protect. A place where families could live in peace, where neighbors looked out for each other, where differences were settled through dialogue rather than discrimination. Sarah Washington rose from her seat in the back, tears streaming down her cheeks as she made her way to her husband's side. "We just wanted to be part of this community," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We wanted to contribute, to be good neighbors. Instead, we've been made to feel like intruders in our own home." The room erupted in a cacophony of voices as residents tried to express their shock, their apologies, their newfound understanding of what the Washingtons had endured. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd to reach Marcus, her elderly hands shaking as she gripped his arm. "My Tommy talks about you sometimes," she said through her tears. "About the day you came for them. He said you ran through enemy fire like it was nothing, like saving their lives was just another day at the office. He said you carried wounded Marines on your back for 3 miles through hostile territory." She looked up at him with eyes full of gratitude. "He said you were the bravest man he'd ever seen." Marcus gently covered her hands with his own. "Tommy was brave too. Mrs. Patterson. They all were. I just did what anyone would do for their brothers." "No," she insisted. "Not anyone. You did that. And we treated you like—" She couldn't finish the sentence, overcome by shame and regret. Hutchins watched this exchange from the doorway. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. He seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, the true magnitude of his actions. He had not simply assaulted a neighbor, or even just a serviceman. He had attacked a genuine American hero, a man whose courage and sacrifice had saved lives and embodied the highest ideals of military service. "I didn't know," he mumbled, but the words fell flat in the emotionally charged atmosphere. Marcus turned to look at him, and for a moment, there was something almost like pity in his expression. "That's the problem, Officer Hutchins. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You saw what you expected to see, what your prejudices told you to see. You never bothered to look deeper, to see the person behind your assumptions." The truth of this statement was undeniable. Hutchins had spent months harassing the Washingtons, escalating his aggression with each encounter, never once pausing to consider that he might be wrong about the people he was targeting. His prejudice had blinded him to reality, creating a narrative that justified his worst impulses. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Commander Washington, on behalf of the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, I want to offer you and your wife a formal apology. The treatment you've received is absolutely unacceptable and does not represent the values of our community." She turned to address the room. "Effective immediately. All citations issued to the Washington property are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I'm calling an emergency board meeting to review our enforcement policies and ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Bob Richardson stepped forward, his Marine bearing evident in every movement. "If I may, Mrs. Pemberton, I'd like to make a motion that we officially recognize Commander Washington's service to our country. Maybe we could name the new community center after him, or at least put up a plaque acknowledging what he's done for America." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement from around the room. Residents who had remained silent during months of harassment were now eager to make amends, to somehow balance the scales that had been so dramatically tilted by Hutchins's actions. But Marcus raised a hand, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Richardson, but I don't need monuments or plaques. What I need is for this community to extend the same respect to every resident that you're offering me now. The next family that moves in shouldn't have to be war heroes to deserve basic human dignity." His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, the perspective of someone who had seen the best and worst of humanity under extreme circumstances. He understood that true honor lay not in individual recognition, but in creating a society where such recognition wasn't necessary for basic respect. Jennifer Mills looked up from her phone, where she had been monitoring the viral spread of her video. "Commander Washington, the story is exploding online. News outlets are picking it up. Someone from the Department of Veterans Affairs has already reached out, asking if you need assistance." Marcus nodded, unsurprised by the attention. In the age of social media, stories like this could spread across the globe in minutes, sparking conversations about racism, military service, and community responsibility in forums far removed from this small HOA meeting room. "The attention might actually help," Sarah said quietly, speaking for the first time since joining her husband at the front of the room. "Maybe it will make other communities think twice before they allow this kind of harassment to continue unchecked." Hutchins, who had been slowly edging toward the exit, suddenly found his path blocked by several residents who had no intention of letting him slink away unnoticed. The man who had seemed so formidable just minutes earlier now appeared small and pathetic, his authority stripped away along with his credibility. "Where do you think you're going?" Richardson demanded, his military training evident in the steel in his voice. "You can't assault a decorated war hero and just walk away like nothing happened." Mrs. Pemberton picked up her phone, her fingers steady as she dialed. "I'm calling the police, the real police, to file a report about what happened here today. Officer Hutchins may think he's above the law, but he's about to learn otherwise." As she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had found her courage after witnessing an unforgivable injustice. The transformation was remarkable. From the uncertain woman who had struggled to maintain control at the beginning of the meeting to the decisive leader now taking charge of the situation. Hutchins's face went through several shades of pale as he realized that his actions would have consequences far beyond the loss of his HOA contract. Assault charges, civil rights violations, and potential federal involvement in a case involving discrimination against a military veteran could end not just his career, but his freedom. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake. I lost my temper. Can't we just forget this whole thing happened?" The plea fell on deaf ears. Too much had been said. Too much had been recorded. Too much damage had been done for simple forgiveness to suffice. The residents of Willowbrook Heights had seen their community's darkest impulses exposed in stark detail, and they were determined to make amends in the most meaningful way possible. Marcus looked around the room, seeing faces that had been transformed by the events of the past hour. Neighbors who had remained silent during months of harassment were now vocal in their support. People who had perhaps harbored their own unexamined prejudices were confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and their community. "Officer Hutchins," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized his entire response to the crisis. "I want you to understand something. What you did today wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on every person who has ever worn this uniform. Every family member who has waited at home while their loved ones served in harm's way. Every American who believes that military service deserves respect, regardless of the color of the person providing it." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "But more than that, it was an attack on the very ideals that I and millions of others have sworn to defend. The idea that all Americans deserve equal treatment under the law. That respect should be based on character rather than prejudice. That our communities should be places where everyone can pursue their dreams without fear of harassment or discrimination." Hutchins tried to respond, but no words came. He stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. as the full implications of his actions crashed down around him like a building collapsing. The sound of sirens in the distance announced the arrival of the police. Real police officers who would treat this situation with the seriousness it deserved. Mrs. Pemberton had been thorough in her phone call, explaining not just the immediate assault, but the months of harassment that had preceded it. As the sirens grew closer, Marcus made a decision that would define how this story ended. He turned to face Hutchins directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Officer Hutchins, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I pity you. You've spent so much energy on hatred that you've forgotten what it means to serve your community with honor. But it's not too late for you to learn. If you're willing to face the consequences of your actions and genuinely work to become a better person." The grace inherent in this statement was not lost on anyone in the room. Here was a man who had been physically assaulted and racially abused, offering forgiveness to his attacker, even as that attacker faced the consequences of his actions. It was a moment that revealed the true character of both men, the vast gulf between them in terms of honor, dignity, and moral courage. The police officers who entered the room found a scene unlike anything they might have expected. Instead of chaos and continued confrontation, they discovered a room full of people united in their support for justice and their determination to ensure that the events of this day would lead to positive change, rather than simply punishment. Detective Sarah Chen, a 20-year veteran of the force, quickly assessed the situation and began interviewing witnesses. The story that emerged was consistent and damning a pattern of harassment based on racial prejudice that had culminated in physical assault during a civil proceeding. "Commander Washington," she said after reviewing the preliminary statements, "I want you to know that we take these charges very seriously. Assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority are all potential felonies in this case." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Detective Chen, I want justice, but I also want this to be a learning opportunity for our community. Perhaps there's a way to address both needs." As the formal investigation began, word of the incident continued to spread beyond the confines of Willowbrook Heights. Local news stations arrived to cover the story. National news outlets picked up the viral video, and military advocacy groups began organizing support for the Washington family. But perhaps the most significant change was happening right there in the HOA meeting room. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other were having deep conversations about prejudice and community responsibility. Plans were being made not just to reform HOA policies, but to create programs that would bring residents together and foster genuine understanding between people of different backgrounds. Mrs. Patterson approached Marcus and Sarah as the formal proceedings wound down. "I know this doesn't make up for what you've been through," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. "But I want you to know that you have allies in this community. Real allies who will stand up for you if anything like this ever happens again." Sarah Washington smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile she had worn in months. "That means more to us than you could possibly know. Mrs. Patterson, we moved here because we wanted to be part of a real community, not just live in a collection of houses. Today, despite everything that happened, I think we found what we were looking for." As Officer Hutchins was led away in handcuffs, his career and reputation in ruins, the residents of Willowbrook Heights began the hard work of rebuilding trust and creating the inclusive community they had always claimed to want. It would not be easy, and it would not happen overnight. But the events of this day had created a foundation of shared experience and common purpose that had been missing before. Marcus Washington stood at the front of the room, still wearing his dress blues, still carrying himself with the dignity that no amount of hatred or prejudice could diminish. He had served his country with honor in foreign lands. And now he had served his community with equal honor at home. The battles were different, but the principles remained the same: courage in the face of adversity, grace under pressure, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals that make America worth defending. In the end, that was perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. True patriotism was not about flags or uniforms or grand gestures. It was about the daily choice to treat all Americans with the dignity and respect they deserved, to stand up for justice even when it was difficult, and to never stop working toward the more perfect union that the founders envisioned and that every generation must help create anew. As the sun set over Willowbrook Heights, casting long shadows across streets where children would grow up with a better understanding of what it meant to be neighbors, the community began to heal. It would take time, effort, and continued vigilance to ensure that the lessons learned this day were not forgotten. But for the first time in months, Marcus and Sarah Washington felt truly at home in the place they had chosen to build their future, surrounded by people who had proven themselves worthy of the sacrifice and service that made such communities possible. The American dream, bruised but not broken, would live on in the bonds forged between neighbors who had learned to see past their differences to the shared humanity that united them all. And in a small HOA meeting room, where justice had finally prevailed, the promise of America was renewed once more.